The plane hadn't even pushed back from the gate, but the tension in first class was already thick enough to cut with a plastic butter knife. Outside, rain drizzled against the windows of JFK, blurring the tarmac lights into soft yellow smears. Inside, the cabin hummed with the low murmur of expensive luggage zipping shut, espresso machines hissing, and the occasional clink of crystal glasses being prepped for takeoff. Near the front window sat a man in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His shoes gleamed under the cabin lights. His hair was perfectly combed, and his watch, thick silver and studded with tiny dials, looked like it could navigate a submarine. He'd boarded with a quiet arrogance, barely acknowledging the flight attendant who greeted him, and now sat scrolling through emails on a sleek laptop, fingers tapping with the impatience of someone used to being obeyed instantly. Beside him in the middle seat was another man, older, maybe mid-40s, with tired eyes and a faded leather jacket that had seen better days. He carried a small duffel bag, not a designer roller, and his hands were rough, the kind that had done real work. Tucked under his arm was a slightly worn stuffed dinosaur, green with one button eye hanging by a thread. He'd just finished a FaceTime call with his daughter before boarding, her voice still echoing in his head. "Daddy, don't forget to look at the clouds for me, okay? And wave if you see a dragon." He'd smiled, promised he would, and ended the call with a soft, "I love you more than rockets." Now, as the plane prepared for departure, his phone buzzed again. A quick video popped up, his daughter in her pajamas holding up a drawing of an airplane with wings made of rainbows. "Look, Daddy, I drew you flying," she whispered, grinning. He couldn't help but answer, voice low and warm. "That's the best plane I've ever seen, sweetheart. I'll keep it safe in my pocket." That's when the man in the gray suit turned his head, not subtly, not politely. He let out a sharp, dismissive snort, just loud enough to be heard over the cabin noise. "Seriously?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, but clearly meant for his seatmate. "Some people think first class is a daycare." The father paused, thumb hovering over the red end call button. He saw his daughter's face light up on the screen, waiting for his response. He didn't want to end it abruptly, not when she'd stayed up past bedtime just to say goodnight one more time. So he kept the call going for just a few more seconds, gave her a soft, "Sweet dreams, my brave girl," and gently hung up. Then he turned to the man beside him, not with anger, but with quiet calm. "Sorry if that bothered you," he said. "She just wanted to say goodnight." The suited man didn't look at him. He snapped his laptop shut with a click. "First class isn't the place for bedtime stories," he said flatly. "There are rules, standards. You pay for silence, not nursery rhymes." A few rows ahead, a woman glanced back. A flight attendant hovering near the galley slowed her steps. The air felt heavier now. The father didn't argue. He just nodded, slightly, and tucked his phone away, placing the stuffed dinosaur carefully on the empty aisle seat beside him, like it was a real passenger. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when you're already carrying enough weight. But the suited man wasn't done. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, he leaned toward the crew, member passing by, and said, just loud enough for his seatmate to hear, "How does someone like that even get upgraded? Did he win a raffle or something?" The flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and decades of experience reading human storms before they broke, gave a polite, neutral smile. "All our guests are valued, sir," she said smoothly, moving on without missing a beat. The father kept his gaze out the window. Raindrops raced down the glass. He thought about his daughter's drawing, tucked now in his jacket pocket. He thought about the double shift he'd just finished at the flight school, teaching new pilots how to handle emergencies, how to stay calm when everything goes wrong. He thought about the custody hearing next week, the lawyer's fees piling up, the nights he'd spent on the couch so his daughter could have the bed during her weekend visits. He hadn't wanted first class. He'd used every frequent flyer, mile he had, plus a chunk of his savings just to get this seat, because the red-eye coach was full, and he needed to be in London by morning for his sister's wedding. She'd been his rock after his wife passed, and he wasn't going to miss it. Not for anything. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway. The suited man ordered a double espresso, then a glass of sparkling water with lemon, no ice obviously, and made a show of checking his watch every 30 seconds as if time itself was personally offending him by moving too slowly. When the father reached into his bag for a bottle of water, the suited man raised an eyebrow. "You brought your own? How resourceful." The word dripped with sarcasm. "Trying to save a few dollars," the father replied simply. "Every bit helps when you're raising a kid alone." That seemed to amuse the man. He let out a short laugh, dry, humorless. "Right, single dad, the modern tragedy." He turned back to his screen, but not before adding, "Must be tough. No backup, no real support. Just you and a stuffed T-Rex against the world." The father didn't flinch. He unscrewed the cap of his water and took a slow sip. He'd heard worse, much worse. From judges, from ex-in-laws, from strangers who thought they knew his life after one glance. What stung wasn't the words. It was the assumption that his life was somehow less than. That love, sacrifice, and showing up every day for someone who depends on you wasn't as impressive as closing a $1 million deal. Outside, the plane turned onto the runway. The engines roared to life, a deep, powerful growl that vibrated through the seats. The father closed his eyes for a second, feeling the familiar surge of takeoff, the push into your back, the ground falling away, the world shrinking below. Flying had always been his peace. Even now, even with everything weighing on him, the moment the wheels left the earth still felt like magic. He opened his eyes and looked out. The city lights stretched like scattered stars. Somewhere down there his daughter was asleep, dreaming of dragons in the clouds. He smiled faintly. The suited man, meanwhile, was already typing furiously, barking, into a Bluetooth earpiece about Q3 projections and non-negotiable margins. He didn't look out the window once. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Flight attendants moved quietly down the aisle with trays of warm towels and gourmet meals. The suited man ordered the filet mignon, medium rare, with truffle mashed potatoes. The father declined the meal. He'd eaten a peanut butter sandwich in the terminal, but accepted a cup of black coffee. When the suited man's steak arrived, perfectly seared and glistening, he took a bite and sighed dramatically. Finally, something done right today. Then he glanced at the father's empty tray. Not hungry? Or just not used to real food? The father stirred his coffee. "I'm fine, thanks." "You know," the suited man continued as if they were old friends sharing life advice, "if you want to get ahead, you've got to act like you belong in places like this, not like you're borrowing someone else's seat." The father looked at him then, not with anger but with something deeper. Pity maybe, or understanding. "I belong wherever my daughter needs me to be," he said quietly. "And right now, that's on this plane, heading to my sister's wedding. That's enough for me." The suited man opened his mouth to reply, but something in the father's tone, the steadiness, the lack of defensiveness, threw him off. He blinked, then turned back to his steak, suddenly less hungry. For the next hour, silence settled between them. The father pulled out a small notebook and began sketching. Cloud formations, mostly. He used to do this with his wife during long flights. She'd say, "Draw me the sky the way you see it." And he would, in quick, confident lines. Now he did it for his daughter. He'd show her the drawings when he got back. "See? That's where I saw the dragon you asked for." The suited man watched out of the corner of his eye. He saw the care in each stroke, the way the man's rough hands moved with surprising gentleness. It confused him. This wasn't the image he'd built in his head, a struggling, overwhelmed single dad barely holding it together. This man was calm, centered, like he carried his own kind of quiet strength, one that didn't need to announce itself. But pride wouldn't let him admit that. So instead he finished his wine, closed his laptop and put on noise-canceling headphones, as if building a wall between them. Outside, the night deepened. Stars pricked the black canvas above the Atlantic. Inside, the cabin hummed with the soft rhythm of sleep and distant conversations. And then, without warning, the the plane dropped. Not a gentle dip. A sudden, stomach-lurching plunge that sent coffee cups sliding, overhead bins rattling, and a chorus of gasps through the cabin. The lights flickered. Oxygen masks tumbled from the ceiling with a hiss. The suited man grabbed his armrests, eyes wide with panic. What the hell? The father didn't flinch. He reached up, pulled down his mask, and secured it calmly. Then, without hesitation, he leaned across the aisle to help an elderly woman fumble with hers. "Breathe slow," he told her, voice steady. "You're okay." The intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice, usually calm, authoritative, now strained, urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced a dual-engine flameout due to severe bird strike. We're attempting restart procedures. Mayday, mayday." Silence. Then chaos. Crying. Prayers. The suited man was hyperventilating, muttering, "No, no, no, this can't be happening." Then a new voice came over the speaker, sharper, more desperate. "Is there any fighter pilot on board?" Repeat, "Any fighter pilot? We need assistance in the cockpit now." Every head turned. Every eye searched. And in that moment, the man in the worn leather jacket stood up. But that was for later. For now, in the trembling quiet after the captain's plea, the suited man looked at his seatmate, really looked at him for the first time, and saw not a struggling single dad, but someone who didn't flinch when the sky fell. The plane shuddered again. The lights dimmed further, and the real story was just beginning. The cabin was quiet now, not peaceful, but the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm breaks. People held their breath. Some clutched armrests. Others gripped the hands of strangers. The oxygen masks dangled like ghostly fruit from the ceiling, swaying slightly with every shudder of the plane. Outside, the night sky offered no comfort, just endless black, no stars, no moon, nothing to anchor you to the world below. The man in the gray suit sat frozen, his knuckles white around the armrests. His expensive watch glinted under the dim emergency lights, but it felt useless now. Time wasn't something you controlled, it was something slipping through your fingers. He'd spent years building a life where he called the shots, where panic was a weakness he'd long outgrown. But right now, all that power meant nothing. He couldn't command the engines back to life. He couldn't negotiate with gravity. He couldn't even stop his own hands from shaking. Beside him, the father remained calm. He'd already helped the elderly woman across the aisle secure her mask, then turned to a young boy 2 rows ahead who was crying softly into his mother's shoulder. "Hey," the father said gently, crouching slightly in the narrow aisle. "Look at me. Breathe with me, okay? In and out. Like this." He demonstrated slow, steady breaths, his voice low and steady like a lullaby wrapped in steel. The boy sniffled, then mimicked him. His mother mouthed thank you with tears in her eyes. Back in his seat, the father didn't make a show of it. He simply adjusted his own mask, checked the straps, and kept his eyes forward. Not at the ceiling, not at the floor, but straight ahead, as if he were already solving the problem in his head. His hands rested loosely on his knees, relaxed but ready. It was the posture of someone who'd been trained to act, not react. The suited man watched him out of the corner of his eye. He wanted to say something, ask how he stayed so calm maybe. But his throat felt tight, his pride still tangled up in the insults he'd thrown just an hour ago. How do you ask for help from someone you mocked for being just a dad? Then the intercom crackled again. This time it was the co-pilot's voice, shaky, strained. "We're losing altitude faster than expected. Captain's trying manual restart, but systems are unresponsive." The sentence trailed off into static. A beat of silence. Then, "If there's anyone with military flight experience, please come forward immediately." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A few passengers glanced around nervously. One man raised his hand halfway, then dropped it, unsure. Another whispered, "My cousin flew Cessnas," but trailed off, knowing it wasn't enough. The father didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt with a soft click, stood and turned to the nearest flight attendant, who was pale but holding her composure. "Tell the captain," he said, voice clear and calm. "Major Daniel Reyes, F-16, 1 in 27 combat missions. I'm coming." The flight attendant's eyes widened. She nodded quickly and pressed her earpiece. "Sir, we have a former fighter pilot offering assistance." A pause. Then relief flooded her face. "Yes, right away." The suited man stared. The words F-16 and combat missions landed like stones in his gut. This wasn't just some weekend hobbyist. This was someone who'd flown jets through war zones, who'd made split-second decisions with lives on the line, and he'd been sitting right next to him, holding a stuffed dinosaur, talking to his daughter like any ordinary dad. As the father moved toward the cockpit, passengers instinctively made space. Some reached out to touch his sleeve, as if his presence alone could steady the plane. He gave small nods, reassuring smiles. Nothing grand, just human gestures that said, "I've got this." The suited man watched him disappear behind the curtain into the cockpit. Then he looked down at his own hand, still trembling. He thought about all the times he'd equated success with titles, salaries, corner offices. He'd built his identity on being the smartest, the strongest, the one in control. But real strength, he was starting to realize, wasn't about how much you owned. It was about what you carried and how you carried it. Back in the cockpit, chaos reigned, but the kind of chaos that still had structure, like a storm with a center. The captain, a veteran with 20 years in the air, was sweating through his uniform, hands gripping the yoke as the plane continued its slow, sickening descent. The co-pilot lay slumped in his seat, unconscious, hit hard during the bird strike when the plane bucked violently. Warning lights blinked red across the panel. Alarms beeped in short, urgent bursts. When the father stepped in, the captain turned, eyes bloodshot but sharp. "You're the fighter pilot?" "Former," the father said, already scanning the instruments. "But I know emergency glide protocols. Let me help." He didn't wait for permission. He slid into the co-pilot's seat, adjusted the harness with practiced ease, and began calling out readings. Altitude, airspeed, wind shear, his voice calm, rhythmic, like a metronome in the middle of a hurricane. The captain, exhausted but relieved, started following his lead. Outside the cockpit, the suited man couldn't sit still. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, pacing the narrow space near the galley. A flight attendant gently urged him to sit, but he shook his head. "I need air," he muttered, though there was no fresh air to be had. He looked around the cabin. People were praying, crying, holding each other. A woman clutched a photo of her children. A teenager texted furiously, as if words could stop the fall, and on the empty aisle seat beside his own, the green stuffed dinosaur sat upright as if keeping watch. Something about that toy, so small, so ordinary, pierced through his arrogance like a needle. That man hadn't been showing off. He hadn't been careless. He'd been carrying a piece of his daughter with him, a tiny anchor to the life he was fighting to get back to. And while the suited man had been busy judging him for it, that same man was now in the cockpit trying to save everyone on board. The plane shuddered again, dropping sharply. A gasp went through the cabin. The suited man grabbed a seat back to steady himself. His heart hammered against his ribs. He thought about his own life, endless meetings, luxury cars, penthouse views, and realized with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity how empty it all felt in this moment. No amount of money could buy calm like the kind that man had shown. No contract could guarantee the kind of love that made someone carry a worn-out toy across an ocean just to make a child smile. He sank back into his seat, head in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt small. Not weak, just human, and maybe that was okay. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the father was working fast. "We need to reduce drag," he said. "Retract flaps to 10 degrees. Trim nose up slightly, just enough to maintain glide slope." His fingers danced over the controls, adjusting, compensating, reading the sky like a language only he understood. He'd trained for this, not this exact scenario, but the principles were the same. When engines fail, you become a glider. You trade altitude for distance. You find the balance between falling and flying. "How much runway do we have at Shannon?" he asked, referring to the emergency airport in Ireland they were aiming for. "About 9,000 feet, the captain replied, voice tight. "But crosswinds are picking up." "Gust to 30 knots, the father nodded. "We can handle it, but we need to lose altitude slower. Let's use the wind, ride the updrafts if we can." He reached for the radio. "Shannon Tower, this is Flight 422, declaring emergency. Dual engine failure. One pilot incapacitated. We have a former military pilot assisting. Request immediate clearance and emergency services on standby." Static, then a calm Irish voice. "Flight 422, Shannon Tower copies. You're cleared for emergency landing on runway 24. Fire and rescue standing by. Godspeed." Back in the cabin, the flight attendants moved with quiet urgency. Ensuring everyone was seated, belts fastened, seats upright. One knelt beside the suited man. "Sir, please remain seated. We'll be landing soon." He looked up at her. "Will we both make it?" She didn't lie. Didn't sugarcoat. "We have the best chance we could hope for. And we have someone up front who knows exactly what he's doing." The suited man nodded. He glanced again at the stuffed dinosaur. On impulse, he picked it up. It was soft, slightly lumpy, with a faint smell of laundry detergent and crayons. He held it carefully, as if it were made of glass. Minutes ticked by. The plane descended steadily now, no longer plummeting but gliding, smooth, controlled, purposeful. The father's voice occasionally came over the intercom, calm and clear. "We're approaching Shannon. Prepare for landing.
Keep your seatbelts tight."
Heads down. Brace position on my signal." People obeyed without question. There was trust in his voice, the kind earned not by titles but by action. The suited man closed his eyes. He thought about what he'd say if they made it. Would he apologize? Would it even matter? Or would the other man just nod and walk away, carrying his dinosaur and his quiet dignity back to the life that truly mattered? The plane banked gently, lining up with the runway. Lights appeared in the distance. Shannon's approach lights blinking like a promise. The father in the cockpit made one final adjustment, his hands steady, his mind clear. He thought of his daughter asleep in her bed, dreaming of dragons in the clouds. He'd promised to come back, and he always kept his promises. Outside, the rain had stopped. The runway rushed toward them, wet and gleaming under the airport lights. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, then a screech of rubber and friction as the brakes engaged. The plane slowed, swerved slightly in the crosswind, but held true. And then, stillness. The engines were silent. The alarms were off. The only sound was the hiss of hydraulics and the collective exhale of 200 people who had just stared down the edge of the world and stepped back. In the cockpit, the captain slumped forward, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. The father just nodded. "Let's get everyone off safely." Back in first class, the suited man clutched the stuffed dinosaur to his chest. He didn't care who saw. He was alive. They were all alive, and it was because of the man he'd mocked for being just a dad. As the cabin lights brightened and the fastened seatbelt sign clicked off, passengers began to stir, some crying, some laughing, many hugging strangers. The flight attendants opened the doors and the cool Irish air rushed in, smelling of rain and earth and safety. The suited man stood slowly. He walked to the cockpit door just as the father emerged, looking exhausted but composed. Their eyes met. The suited man held out the dinosaur. I held on to this," he said, voice rough. "For your daughter." The father took it gently. "Thank you," he said simply. There was so much more to say, apologies, questions, maybe even gratitude. But neither man spoke it. Some things don't need words. Outside, ambulances waited. Paramedics checked on the unconscious co-pilot. Passengers gathered on the tarmac, wrapped in blankets, staring up at the plane that had almost been their tomb. The suited man stood apart, watching the father speak quietly with officials, then walk toward the terminal, the green dinosaur tucked under his arm like a badge of honor. He didn't follow. He just stood there, breathing in the cold night air, feeling something shift inside him, something old cracking open to make room for something new. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a CEO. He just felt like a man who'd been given a second chance. The rain had stopped by the time they stepped onto the tarmac, but the air still clung damp and cool to skin. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, red and white ambulances, fire trucks with ladders raised just in case, and a small crowd of airport staff huddled near the terminal doors, watching in silence. The plane sat like a grounded bird, its wings still, its engines cold. Inside, people were still catching their breath, still blinking as if waking from a nightmare they couldn't quite shake. The father walked slowly toward the terminal, the green stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm like a quiet secret. He didn't look for applause, didn't expect thanks. He'd done what needed doing, nothing more, nothing less. His hands were steady now, but his body ached with the kind of tired that settles deep in your bones after holding yourself together for too long. He thought about calling his sister. She'd be waiting at the wedding venue, probably frantic by now. But he didn't have his phone. It was still in his seat pocket back on the plane. Behind him, the suited man lingered near the aircraft stairs, wrapped in a foil emergency blanket that crinkled with every step. He watched the father disappear into the terminal, then turned to look at the plane one last time. It felt surreal, like the last 2 hours hadn't really happened, but the taste of fear was still in his mouth. The memory of helplessness still coiled in his chest. Inside the terminal, chaos had given way to calm procedure. Passengers were being guided to a holding area, a large, brightly lit lounge with rows of chairs, bottled water, and counselors in soft-colored vests moving quietly among them. Some people were on phones, voices trembling as they told loved ones they were okay. Others just sat, staring into space, processing what had almost been lost. The father found a quiet corner near a window and sank into a chair. He ran a hand over his face, then pulled the stuffed dinosaur onto his lap. He smoothed its worn fabric, adjusted the loose button eye. "We made it, buddy," he whispered. "Told you I'd come back." A flight attendant approached, holding a cup of hot tea. "Here," she said gently. "You earned this." He took it with a nod. "Thanks. How's the co-pilot?" "Stable concussion, but awake. They're taking him to the hospital as a precaution." She paused. "You saved us." "All of us," he shook his head. "The captain did most of it. I just helped read the sky." She smiled, but her eyes were serious. "Don't downplay it. We all saw what you did." Before he could reply, an airport official in a dark uniform approached, clipboard in hand. "Sir, we'll need a formal statement about what happened in the cockpit. And the airline would like to speak with you as soon as possible." He sighed. "Of course." But before he could stand, a voice cut through the hum of the room. "Wait." The suited man stood a few feet away, still wrapped in the silver blanket, his expensive suit wrinkled and damp at the shoulders. He looked different, smaller somehow, less polished, more real. The father looked up, not with suspicion but with quiet patience. "I need to say something," the suited man said, his voice low but clear. He glanced around as if making sure no one was listening, though everyone nearby had gone still. "Back on the plane, I was wrong. About everything." The father didn't interrupt. He just waited, I thought. "I don't know what I thought." The man continued, rubbing his temples. "That success meant never needing help. That being in control meant never showing fear. That people like you, good people, steady people, were somehow less." He swallowed hard. "But you didn't just fly that plane. You held everyone together, even me." He took a step closer. "I mocked you for talking to your daughter, for carrying that toy. And all along, that's what kept you grounded when the rest of us were falling apart." The father looked down at the dinosaur in his lap. "She's 6, he said simply. "Her mom's gone. So it's just us. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is let someone know you're thinking of them even when you're scared." The suited man nodded slowly. "I don't have kids," he admitted. "Never made time for it. Always chasing the next deal, the next milestone. But watching you, I realized I've been measuring my life in all the wrong ways." There was a long silence, not awkward, just heavy with meaning. Finally, the father spoke again. "You don't have to fix everything tonight," he said. "But maybe, start by being kinder. To others. To yourself." The suited man let out a shaky breath. "I'd like that." He didn't ask for forgiveness. Didn't offer money or connections. He just stood there, human and humbled, and that was enough. Later, after giving his statement and speaking briefly with airline reps, who were already talking about hero pilot headlines and extraordinary service, the father was finally allowed to leave. His sister had arrived at the airport, frantic but relieved, and wrapped him in a hug that lasted a full minute. "You scared 10 years off my life," she whispered. Tears in her eyes. "Sorry," he said, hugging her back. "But I'm here, and I brought a dragon." She laughed through her tears and took the stuffed dinosaur from him. "She's gonna lose her mind." They walked out of the terminal together into the cool Irish night. The wedding was postponed, no one cared. All that mattered was that he was safe. Meanwhile, the suited man sat alone in the lounge, sipping water, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft pinks and golds. He'd called his assistant and canceled his London meetings. Something came up, he'd said. Personal. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or market share. He was thinking about a little girl who drew airplanes with rainbow wings, about a man who carried her love across an ocean like armor, about how courage doesn't always wear a uniform. It sometimes wears a worn leather jacket and holds a stuffed toy like a promise. Back in New York, days later, The story made headlines. Former fighter pilot saves jet after engine failure. News vans camped outside the flight school where the father now taught. Reporters called asking for interviews for dramatic retellings. He declined most of them. "I was just doing my job," he'd say. Anyone with that training would have done the same. But the truth was, not everyone would have stayed calm. Not everyone would have carried that quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout because it's built on love, not ego. The suited man read every article, watched every clip. He never reached out again. But one morning, a plain envelope arrived at the flight school. Inside was a first-class round-trip ticket to Orlando, and a note, "For you and your daughter. She deserves to see real dragons at the theme park, and you deserve a day where you're not the hero, just a dad having fun with his girl. Someone who finally understands what matters." The father read it twice. Then he tucked it into his wallet, next to his daughter's latest drawing, a new airplane, this one with a green dinosaur in the cockpit. He didn't know who sent it, and maybe that was the point. Some lessons aren't meant to be repaid, they're meant to be passed on. Weeks later, he and his daughter stood in front of Cinderella's castle, her hand in his, her eyes wide with wonder. She wore a tiny pilot's cap he'd bought her at the gift shop, and clutched the green dinosaur like a co-pilot. "Did you see a dragon in the clouds today, Daddy?" she asked. He smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, I think I did." And for the first time in a long time, he felt light, not because the danger was behind him, but because he knew deep in his bones that the things worth protecting aren't things at all. They're people, moments, love that shows up, even when the sky falls. Back in his office, thousands of miles away, the suited man stared at his wall of awards, glass plaques, framed deals, photos with celebrities and politicians. For the first time, they looked hollow. So he took them down, all of them. In their place, he hung a single print. A child's drawing of an airplane with rainbow wings, sent anonymously with no return address. He didn't know it was hers, but he liked to think it was. And every morning, before his first meeting, he'd look at it and remember. Real strength isn't about how high you fly. It's about who you bring with you when you land. The days after the emergency landing passed in a blur of phone calls, interviews, and well-meaning strangers stopping the father in the grocery store to say, "I saw you on the news, you're a hero." He'd nod politely, thank them, and keep moving. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a dad who'd been lucky enough to remember his training when it mattered most. But the world didn't see it that way. To them, he was the quiet man in the leather jacket who'd stepped into chaos and brought everyone home. His daughter, of course, thought it was the coolest thing ever. "My daddy flew a real plane with no engines," she told her kindergarten class. Holding up the green dinosaur like a trophy, her teacher sent a note home. "She's been drawing airplanes all week, and she says you're her superhero." He'd smiled, tucked the note into his wallet, and kissed the top of her head before tucking her in that night. But not everyone celebrated quietly. Back in New York, the suited man sat in his corner office, the same one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, and stared at his reflection in the glass. The view used to make him feel powerful. Now it just felt empty. He'd canceled 3 major deals in the past week, not because they weren't profitable, but because they didn't feel right. He kept thinking about the way that man had moved in the cockpit, not with show, not with ego, but with purpose. Every action had meaning. Every word had weight. He'd started doing small things, things he never would have considered before. He tipped the barista double just because she looked tired. He held the elevator for a woman struggling with strollers. He even called his younger brother, the one he hadn't spoken to in 2 years after an argument about their father's will, and said simply, "I miss you." It wasn't grand. It wasn't headline-worthy, but it was real. One evening, while scrolling through news clips about the flight, he came across a short interview with a passenger, a retired school teacher who'd been sitting in economy. "That man didn't just save our lives," she said, eyes glistening. "He reminded us what it means to be human. While the rest of us were panicking, he was helping others. Calm, kind, like he'd already decided long ago that fear wouldn't get to steer his life." The suited man paused the video. He replayed that sentence 3 times. Fear wouldn't get to steer his life. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For years he'd thought fear was weakness, But maybe it wasn't about not feeling fear. It was about not letting it drive. And that man? He'd been afraid too. You could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when the plane dropped. But he'd chosen to act anyway. For his daughter, for strangers, for the promise he'd made to come home. The suited man picked up his phone. He didn't call his assistant, didn't check stock prices. Instead, he opened a new browser tab and typed, Veteran Support Organizations, Childcare Programs. He spent the next hour reading. About single parents who served. About pilots who came home to empty houses. About kids who grew up fast because their moms or dads carried invisible wounds from wars no one talked about. His chest tightened. He'd flown first class for years, sipping champagne while people like that man, people who'd given everything for their country, were working double shifts just to afford daycare. Before he could talk himself out of it, he clicked donate. He didn't give a small amount. He gave enough to fund a full year of after-school care for 5 veteran families. And he did it anonymously. No press release. No logo on a plaque. Just a quiet transfer, with a note that read, For the ones who hold it together when the world falls apart. A week later, he received a generic thank you email from the nonprofit. No fanfare, no spotlight. And for the first time in his life, that felt like a win. Meanwhile, the father returned to his routine. Early mornings at the flight school, teaching new recruits how to handle stalls, spins, and system failures. He used the near crash as a case study, not to scare them, but to show them that training isn't just about muscle memory. It's about mindset. When everything goes wrong, he'd say, your job isn't to be fearless. It's to be useful. His students listened, not because he was famous now, but because he spoke like someone who'd lived it. One afternoon after class, a young woman hung back. She was one of his best students, sharp, focused, always the first to volunteer for simulator drills. Sir, she said hesitantly, my little brother's school is doing a Heroes in Our Community project. He asked if he could interview you. The father smiled. Of course, but tell him I'm not a hero, just a guy who knew what to do. He already thinks you are, she said softly. And honestly? So do I, he didn't argue. Some truths don't need correcting. That weekend, he met the boy at a local park. The kid was 10, nervous, clutching a notebook like it was a lifeline. He asked questions about flying, about the emergency, about what it felt like to be scared. The father answered honestly, no sugarcoating, no drama. It felt like time slowed down, he said. And all I could think was, I have to get back to her. That's what kept me clear. The boy wrote it down carefully. Then quietly, my dad's in the Navy, he's overseas right now. Sometimes I worry he won't come back. The father looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone, one he'd picked up on the beach near Shannon after the landing. Take this, he said. It's from Ireland, a place where a lot of people came home safe because someone chose to care. Keep it in your pocket. And every time you touch it, remember, your dad chose to serve because he cares too. And caring people always find their way back. The boy's eyes filled with tears. He nodded, clutching the stone like a talisman. Later, the father's student sent him a photo, her brother holding the stone, standing in front of his school project poster. At the top, in big, bold letters, my hero, a pilot who came home for his daughter. He printed the photo and taped it to his fridge. Right next to his daughter's drawings, back in the city, the suited man had started visiting a community center near his office, one that offered free tutoring for kids from military families. He didn't announce himself, just showed up on Tuesdays and Thursdays, sat at a small table and helped with math homework. At first, the kids were wary. Who was this stiff-looking man in expensive shoes? But he didn't talk down to them. Didn't try to impress. He just listened. Asked questions. Made bad jokes that made them groan and laugh. One boy, maybe 8, asked him point blank, "Are you rich?" He didn't lie. "Yeah, I am." "Then why are you here?" The boy asked, squinting. The suited man thought for a moment. "Because I used to think money made me important. But I met someone who showed me that real importance comes from showing up for people. So, I'm trying." The boy nodded as if that made perfect sense. "My mom says heroes don't wear capes. They wear work boots." The suited man smiled. She's right, he started bringing snacks. Not fancy ones, just granola bars and juice boxes. Small things, human things. One evening, as he walked back to his car, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from the airline. They were honoring the father at a private ceremony for extraordinary courage and service. The suited man wasn't invited, and he didn't expect to be, but he read the details anyway. The event was next week. In Chicago, he didn't plan to go, but the night before, he found himself booking a last-minute flight. Not first class this time, coach, just him, a carry-on, and a small wrapped box he'd bought on his lunch break. He arrived early, standing at the back of the room as the airline executives gave speeches, handed out plaques, played a video montage of the flight. The father stood quietly at the podium, accepting the award with grace, then saying only, "I'm grateful we all made it home. That's the only reward I need." Afterward, guests mingled. Champagne flowed. Cameras flashed. The suited man stayed near the wall unnoticed. He watched the father talk with other pilots, with flight attendants, with the co-pilot who'd recovered and flown in just to thank him. There was no pride in his posture, just warmth, connection. Finally, as the crowd thinned, the suited man approached. The father saw him and didn't look surprised. Just nodded like he'd been expecting this moment all along. "I didn't come to make a scene," the suited man said, "just to say thank you. Again." "You already did," the father replied gently. "With that ticket? We had the best time," the suited man blinked. "You knew it was me." "I didn't," the father admitted. "But it didn't matter who sent it. What mattered was that someone understood." They stood in silence for a beat. Then the suited man held out the small box. "This isn't much, but it's from me." No strings, the father opened it. Inside was a simple silver compass, old-fashioned with a worn leather strap. Engraved on the back, "True north isn't a place. It's a person." He looked up, eyes soft. "Thank you. I've been trying to find mine," the suited man said quietly. "Turns out it's not in a boardroom." The father closed the box and tucked it into his pocket. "You're doing okay," he said. "Better than okay." They shook hands, firm, brief, full of unspoken respect. As the suited man turned to leave, the father called after him. "Hey," he stopped, "if you ever want to learn to fly, my school gives discounts to people who show up on Tuesdays." The suited man smiled, a real one, not the polished kind he used in meetings. "I might just take you up on that." And for the first time in years, he meant it. That night, on the flight back, he didn't open his laptop. Didn't check emails. He just looked out the window at the clouds, wondering if somewhere up there, a little girl was still dreaming of dragons, and maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe in them too. Months passed, and life settled into a new kind of rhythm. Not the frantic rush of before, but something slower, deeper, like a river finding its course after a storm. The headlines faded. The news vans disappeared. The world moved on as it always does. But for two men who'd shared a few hours in the sky, everything had changed. The father went back to teaching at the flight school, but now his classes felt different. Not because he was famous, though students did sit a little straighter when he walked in, but because he spoke with a kind of quiet certainty that came from knowing what really mattered. He still carried the green dinosaur in his bag, just in case his daughter asked about it. And she did often. "Tell me again how you flew the big plane, Daddy," she'd say, curled up beside him on the couch. He'd tell the story simply, leaving out the fear, focusing on the teamwork, the calm, the way everyone pulled together, because that's what heroes do, he'd say. They help. She'd nod seriously, then whisper, "I'm going to be a pilot too." "I know you will," he'd reply, kissing her forehead. "And I'll be right there in the passenger seat, holding your stuffed dragon." Meanwhile, the suited man kept showing up at the community center every Tuesday and Thursday. He stopped wearing his expensive watch, started carrying a worn backpack instead of a leather briefcase. The kids didn't call him Sir anymore, they called him Mr. T, short for teacher, though he insisted he wasn't one. But he was learning, not just algebra or grammar, but how to listen, how to be present, how to care without expecting anything back. One rainy afternoon, a teenager named Leo, who'd barely spoken to him for weeks, handed him a folded piece of paper. "My mom says I gotta thank you," he mumbled, "for helping me pass science." Inside was a drawing, A man in a suit sitting at a table with a group of kids, books open, smiling. At the bottom, in messy handwriting, "You showed up. That's enough." The suited man tucked it into his wallet, right next to the compass he'd given away, and the one he now carried as a reminder. He'd started taking flying lessons just like the father suggested. Not to impress anyone, not even for himself at first, but because he wanted to understand what it felt like to trust the sky, to read the wind, to hold lives in your hands and choose calm over panic. His instructor was patient, kind, and didn't care that he used to run a billion-dollar company. "Flying doesn't care about your title," she'd said on day one. "It only cares if you're paying attention." He liked that. A lot. One Saturday morning, after a lesson in a small Cessna over the countryside, he landed smoothly, taxied to the hangar, and saw the father waiting by the fence, arms crossed, watching. He walked over, still in his flight suit, helmet under one arm. "You're getting better," the father said. "Still wobble on landing," the suited man admitted. "You always will. That's how you know you're human." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun rise over the runway. Then the father said, "She asked about you." The suited man looked up. "Your daughter?" "Yeah, she saw the drawing Leo made. The one with the man in the suit helping kids," she said. "Is that the nice man from the airplane?" He smiled faintly. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her he's trying to be the kind of man who makes the world a little softer." The suited man looked down at his boots. "I'm not there yet. You don't have to be," the father said. "You just have to keep showing up." That simple sentence stayed with him all week. Back in the city, he made a quiet decision. He stepped down as CEO. Not in a dramatic boardroom showdown, not with a press conference, but with a calm email to the board and a heartfelt conversation with his team. "I've realized my purpose isn't in scaling companies," he wrote. "It's in serving people." He stayed on as an advisor, but handed leadership to someone who loved the work the way he once thought he did. And for the first time in 20 years, he felt relief, not loss. He used part of his savings to fund a scholarship for children of single parents who wanted to learn to fly. No fanfare, no naming rights. Just a small program run through the flight school with a simple mission. If you dream of the sky, you deserve a chance to reach it. The father helped design the curriculum. They called it Wings for Home because flying at its heart isn't about escaping. It's about returning. One evening, as autumn turned to winter, the suited man received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a handmade card drawn in crayon. A plane, a green dinosaur in the cockpit, and two stick figures holding hands on the ground. One had long hair. The other wore a suit. At the bottom, in careful printing, "Thank you for being kind. Love, Lily." He stared at it for a long time. Then he taped it to his fridge, right next to Leo's drawing. He never wrote back. Didn't need to. Some thanks are best carried in the heart, not on paper. Christmas came. Snow dusted the rooftops. The father took his daughter to see the lights in the city park. She wore her pilot's cap and carried the dinosaur like a badge of honor. As they walked past a charity booth collecting toys for families in need, she tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, can we give one too?" He knelt beside her. "You want to pick one out?" She nodded seriously. They chose a stuffed owl, soft, wise-looking, with big eyes. She wrote a note, "For someone who needs a friend in the sky." As they dropped it in the bin, a familiar figure stood nearby, also holding a bag of gifts. The suited man saw them and smiled. No words were needed. Just a nod, a shared understanding. Later that night, alone in his apartment, the suited man sat by the window watching snowfall. His office was quiet now. No late-night calls, no urgent emails. Just peace. On his desk sat the compass, the drawings, the scholarship brochures. And on the wall, the child's rainbow-winged airplane. He thought about the flight. The panic. The moment everything could have ended, and how instead it had become a beginning. He hadn't just been saved from a crash. He'd been saved from a life that looked successful but felt empty. And all it took was one quiet man, holding a toy, choosing love over fear. New Year's Eve arrived. The father and his daughter stayed in, eating pancakes for dinner, watching old movies, laughing until their sides hurt. At midnight, they stood on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching fireworks bloom over the neighborhood. "Make a wish, Daddy," she said. He looked at her, her eyes bright, her cheeks pink from the cold, and whispered, "I already got mine." She hugged him tight. "Me too." Miles away, the suited man stood on his balcony, alone but not lonely. He raised a glass of sparkling cider, not champagne, not this year, and toasted the sky. "To coming home," he said softly. And somewhere in the quiet between the stars, it felt like the universe whispered back, "You did." Time kept moving. Seasons turned. The father kept teaching. The suited man kept volunteering. They didn't talk often, just a text now and then, a wave at the flight school, a shared smile at a community event. But their lives were woven together now, not by fame or drama, but by a quiet thread of mutual respect and changed hearts. Years later, when his daughter was old enough to take her first solo flight, the father stood on the tarmac, watching her taxi down the runway. She'd painted a small green dinosaur on the side of the plane, her tribute, her good luck charm. As the wheels lifted off, he didn't feel fear, just pride and love, deep and steady as the earth. In the crowd watching, the suited man stood beside him, hands in his pockets, eyes on the sky. "She's got your calm," he said. "She's got her own kind of brave," the father replied. They watched in silence as the plane climbed, turned and disappeared into the clouds, and neither man needed to say what they both knew, that sometimes the most extraordinary things begin with the simplest acts, a kind word, a second chance, a stuffed toy held like a promise. And that real heroism isn't about grand gestures, it's about showing up, day after day, for the people who matter most. The end.